welcome to Heart Space Podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Anna.
And I'm Candice. This is a podcast dedicated to all things heart-centered. In each episode, we will open our heart space to share embodied experiences, simple tips, and thoughtful prompts for you to live a heart-centered life.
If you are curious about the wisdom of our hearts, if you are ready to embrace deep transformation, this podcast is for you.
Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any episodes.
From our hearts to yours, Anna and Candice.
Hello. This is our final episode for the season and a closing chapter for Heart Space. Thank you for your support in making this a fruitful and nourishing journey for us. Today, we are thrilled to be sharing with you a conversation we had with Julia, speaking about the topic of art. Art as a well-being, as healing, as inspiration, as a conduit for transformation. And there is no better person to delve into this topic other than Julia. Julia Vasko is an art curator, embodiment facilitator, and somatic therapist. Her work intersects in the creation of safe spaces for expression and connection, where stories are told, where emotions are felt, and where transformation and healing happened. She believes that art has an important role in our healing as individuals and as a collective. It is through art that we can experience repair and cultivate connection, and it is through creativity that we can access our inherent life force and imagine new ways forward. As such, she curates and advocates for programs with art that heal, inspire, and transform. So soften your heart and open your mind for this healing conversation with Julia Vasko. Enjoy. Welcome, Julia. How are you feeling right now? How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling good. I'm feeling a little wobbly, and I had lots of tree time earlier, which always helps. So now that I'm here, I feel more settled than before, for sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying yes to this really small podcast that we have. And we are very excited to have you to share with us today in your perspective and your opinion on the broad topic of art. Which I think with what you have shared with us previously during our conversation, I think there is a lot to dive into to also just allow our listeners to have a little bit more prompts to think about when they think of art beyond what we see in an exhibition, beyond a performance, how it can be influenced by nature or basically by ourselves. Yeah. So to start off, we just want to talk a little bit about art. Like, what is art to you? Because when we think of the word art, it can create an immediate somatic reaction to different people in different ways. Can be a softening, can be spaciousness. It could also stiffen someone up. So, in your opinion, what is art exactly, and what does the role of art do for us and within us?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question to start with, because like even for me receiving that question, there's something in me that goes like because my background is in art history, and like in art history, one of the things that we talk about a lot, or that is like always a question, is, is this art or is it not art? Or what makes good art? And I remember there's always that kind of example that's used of like Marcel Duchamp in the toilet situation. I don't know if you're aware of it, where basically he took a toilet and like put it on a pedestal and said, this is art, and it raised like a lot of controversy, and people were like, how can you say that this is art? It's not art. And this was coming from a history where art was considered to be, like, great art was the most like replicated life the closest, and that's what made it great. So then to be like, and here's this toilet bowl and now it's art, raised a lot of questions. And I think it has a lot to do with, like you were saying, like the role that we assign to art, and I think that art is something that inspires, that provokes, that has the possibility to create affect. And with the case of the toilet bowl, on the pedestal, I feel like it did that. And so I think so much of what is art is so much of the way that we relate to it. There's so many of these stories where something gets put on a wall, like contemporary artists, right? They put a banana peel on the wall and it's like, it's art now, So it's such a loaded question, to start with, because I think it's something that is continuously going to shift according to the times and what is relevant now, probably what is considered art now is, of course, very different than what was considered art before. But yeah, for me personally, I think it's more about what happens when you're looking at it.
That's true. I remember also from studies from school, this question coming up, what can be called art and whether a child's drawing can be considered art. Is that art enough to be called art? So that's, a very good point to just first think about then what's the role of art in the first place. And then dive a little bit deeper and allow for that definition to kind of come up, and maybe for every person it's going to be something else. And maybe that's okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned your background in arts history, and I was just wondering, how did your journey progress from being an art curator to embracing the role of an embodiment facilitator? What inspired or led you to delve into the realm of embodiment alongside your work in the art world?
I mean, it's interesting because me going into kind of curating and kind of majoring in art history and all that stuff, art was very much a intellectual passion. I really loved, when I took my first art history class, I loved this idea of, I went into university either thinking I was going to do psychology because I loved learning about people and behaviors and all this stuff. And then I took my first art history class and I was like, whoa, I can learn about people and I can learn about history and I can learn about place, but from this aesthetic form and this performance, or from this dance, or from whatever form it takes. And that, kind of captured my interest in a way that just felt more alive to me in some way. But even then it was I want to analyze this and I want to understand, why is this artwork important within the context of, history or all these types of things. And then I went into the museums also like that, in terms of every exhibition that I curated, wanting to tell a story and to explain what it was about, and why it was significant. And then I found dance, which was, I started to dance for myself. Not club dancing, or dance classing, but more free flow, intuitive movement. And I think at that point I was also very much feeling on the edge of burnout, and realized that, my mind passion was art, but my heart passion was music, and was starting to kind of notice that a little bit. And when I started to dance, it was this first time where I started to feel myself in a different way. And I think it was just I was approaching art and approaching life very much from this like intellectual kind of space. Like I was approaching myself very much from an intellectual kind of space, and I was always kind of analyzing myself or that. And so when I danced, it felt like I was like being with myself in a way that I hadn't experienced before. Like, oh, I just like got goosebumps a little bit like talking about it. And yeah, it was like the more that I connected to myself, the more I started to experience life differently, and the more I started to feel frustrated with the very mental approaches to art, where it was like, yeah, everything was just like, so what is this about? And I'd be like, well, what is it? Like, when did we stop feeling? When did we stop like, yeah, coming towards things with our whole beings? And what would that feel like? And what would that look like? And yeah, so I eventually, I mean, it's in a bigger context kind of thing, but I just also started to be exposed to very different ways of being that felt, yeah, a little bit more alive, a little bit more embodied. And at the time, it was like these two parts of myself couldn't come together in the moment, and I had to choose, and I chose basically my body. And it was through kind of 3 years of traveling and exploring all these different forms of modalities and things like that, that I realized that like I was still, you know, a curator, like I still had that hat on, but I was starting to see and experience that there's so much more. Like the capacity of art is so great, yet the ways in which we have been engaging with it is so small in these kind of limited forms, you know, whether it's in these institutions or, you know, and I think with the rise of like public art, it helped to kind of shift a little bit out of that a bit so that you are encountering art in your day-to-day. But yeah, I just started to think a lot more about what is it that we can do? What are the conditions that we can create that enable people to kind of drop into their bodies, to come into that space of feeling and then be able to meet art there. And I think when you meet art from that place, art becomes a lot more accessible. And it becomes less of this thing of like, oh, this is for people who know things, because I'm not trying to mentally meet this. But when you come to a space that is shared by all and like come from that space of the heart, come from that felt sense, there's just so much more capacity and so much more potential to experience.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. And I think your job as an art curator, I'm thinking more of like creating exhibitions, and correct me if I'm wrong. Most of it right now, it's kind of like a privilege for you to be able to go to an exhibition and see art and feel like your social status is being, you know, acclaimed or you have achieved something just by posting on Instagram that I have been to this museum and I'm cool here, but it's not really touching a part of you that is deep inside. And when you talk about dance, where you're doing it solely for yourself and there's no other reason, it's just a very simple idea of connecting with the self, that really brings out something else. Like you mentioned, the capacity and potential of creativity, of expression that is so much deeper, that it's beyond words, it's beyond the literature that we already know, it's beyond what we can foresee. It's really the future, and the future is beyond everything else that we can grasp. And that creates the excitement, it creates the sense of newness and wholeness at the same time, and also a little bit of a returning to where you belong. Yeah, so I think that sparked something even more, and it gives you a little bit of a catalyst to then question what kind of art you would like to present to people.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And I think it's, it's interesting. It's like, there's a lot of conversation in museums, and I've been outside of the museum world for some time. So I must disclaim that I'm saying all of this from a little bit of the observer who's still very interested, but not, inside.
Yeah.
But, these conversations about like, well, now you have to make exhibitions Instagrammable, and the way to kind of keep people interested is to create things or create experiences where people can come and they can take photos and things like that. And, I remember when I was in the museum, I was so against it. I was like, it's like, I won't swear, but like you're bastardizing this whole thing.
Yeah.
And I don't want to like be sitting here designing photo ops for people, but it's funny now, like a little bit outside, I have this feeling of like, or even, in my own experience where when I go on long walks and I'm noticing everything, like having that intention of like taking a photo of something that like helps me zoom in and focus and actually be there, I know how helpful that can be at times. And so I think about sometimes in like the museums, if people are going and if they are like using their cameras and like noticing what's there, is that not better than not going at all? Or are we also opening up our minds, to these different ways of engaging? And because ultimately it is about that sense of affect, right? And like, I think I always say that when something moves you, that's when change and transformation can happen and healing can happen, and the way to move someone is to help them to feel connected. And there's so many forms in which that can maybe look like, and there's a lot of experimentation with those forms,
for sure.
I would prefer a little bit more of a meditative approach, and a slow looking and a, breathing and an embodied kind of thing. But that's another thing.
Yeah. Personally, I think my trip to Japan, that was when I realized that it is possible for museums to not allow photos or phones to be brought in at all. Because in Singapore, it's just so common. You would just take it for granted that you can take every photo of every exhibit. But when I went to Japan, and the rule was almost as though it's it's like a silent, non-verbal prerequisite that everybody knows. There is a lot of respect for the spaces when people need to pause and really just read every single word before they go on and move on with the next exhibit. I think that is the beauty of it. So I like that meditative approach that you mentioned.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's definitely my preferred.
So talking about the exhibitions that you are curating, what kind of art is it? If you can share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have this belief, and I think, it's proven to be true for me, but this idea that when you create something from the space of the soul, then when it is met in the space of the soul, that's where what I was saying about that sense of that affect and feeling and change can happen. And I think so often what is happening is that it's almost like getting lost in translation. And especially, I think what has been was a privileging of conceptual art and highly intellectual art. And I think that was very reflective of society, where society was also privileging the mind, privileging intellectualization, privileging thought, and, less about the felt experience, that whole thing of like, push through, mind over body, da-da-da-da, like that was it. And that was being reflected in art too, in terms of what was privileged. And I think that also is what created this sense of people coming in and being like, I I need to know what this is about, and maybe I'm not smart enough to engage with this. Maybe I don't know enough about this whole history to be able to understand or to relate or connect. And so for me, I find that I am drawn towards artists who create from, I don't know how to create from the soul, or create from this deep visceral experience, and who really see their art as a meditation, as a form of connecting to something greater, kind of beyond or within, very much kind of connected into the elements and the earth and things like that. And I think the reason why I get drawn there is because I feel it in my body. It's like I look at something and I'm like, whoa, like, you know, I created this workshop a while ago that was called Moving Images. And it was about dancing with art and like following the brush strokes with your body, and a way of kind of relating in that mirroring way to the movement that had to happen for this to be created. It's like, I don't know, it's felt. That's all I can, it's like the strongest way I can explain it. And like, you know, I can be a little bit of an Instagram stalker when it comes to artists, and like I'll look at things and I'll know like right away, being like, yes, like I can feel them here. And then I meet them and I'm like, yeah, okay. This makes sense. And it's like their artwork then lends itself to be engaged with in that meditative, felt, deep way. And like, I think it's not just, you know, I'm talking about the artists that I encounter day to day, but I think you see that when like you see a Kandinsky, or you see like a Hilma, you know, Hilma van Klimt. You can feel that they're creating from a specific kind of space. And that's what I gravitate towards. Yeah.
Oh, that's very beautiful. I remember at the university when, you know, you were looking at a piece of art, the task was to figure out what does the artist meant over here. What did he try to say? And then you needed to approach that from that space in your mind and kind of put this art into pieces, break it into pieces, and figure this out in a very different way than what you just shared, versus really creating and appreciating art from the heart, from the soul. And I feel that if we would allow ourselves from the very beginning to create space for that, we would there would be way more interest in art in museums. There would be way more understanding of what is this beautiful you know, job as an artist. It is really to represent humanity and the processes that humanity is going through and how important it is. So thank you for sharing that.
May I add
deeply
one thing?
Resonate with that, of course.
Isn't that, like, what came to mind even as you were just sharing was like, why is it that people struggle so much with, let's say, two-dimensional art, or art that is often in museums, but there's, you know, how many thousands of people who are running to a Taylor Swift concert, right? Or like in this idea that, you know, and I mean, I'm like mildly obsessed with Taylor Swift just because of the phenomenon, right? And obviously her, like, having just been here, it's like, you know, seeing people, and it's not just Taylor Swift, but like, you know, musicians where people are crying, where people are like, you know, where it gives them goosebumps and things like that. It's like, why is it that that's somehow more easeful with music in a way that it's harder to do with art? And I think it's not everything, but I think there's partially about, again, that sense of relationship. One was maybe in the homes of people where with their families, they're dancing around to it. And there is a sense of like, oh, this is for me. Right. Yeah. And then other times it can be like art, and especially two-dimensional art. It's like, ooh, okay, like go to lessons, learn the technique, you know? And I guess that happens with music too. But I guess in a different way, I would say, or music seems to fill people's homes in a more kind of casual, connected way that I don't think art always does as well. I mean, and say art in that sense, but like more of the two-dimensional painting kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You know? And I think that's really interesting. Like like I see it with my like niece and my nephew. Like we do a lot of like creating, and I think a lot of kids do that art, but it's like, why is it that it gets to a certain point where either they have to like work on their technique, you know, to become, you know, more established or like professional, but they can continue listening to music, you know? I don't know. That's just something that's coming up that I find interesting.
Yeah. I think there's lesser judgment. And like you said, the relationship that music brings and the point in time when you listen to that music and how you relate to it, how it holds you, brings you to a state of excitement or sadness or embrace. Everything counts bit by bit.
Yeah.
And for art, because it's not as accessible, or we're not given the chance to think and be in the space and to really feel art in the depths of our soul, to really see it beyond just cognitively and intellectually, to understand art as a language of life. If we can do that, then everything else would be like sparkles and fireworks.
Totally. It's like the same. It's like, you know, someone climbs up a mountain and they see a like the sunrise or the sunset, and it's like, wow, that beauty, right? But then there's like this magical painting, like large scale of a sunrise or a sunset that you see in a museum, and it's suddenly like, I see what they were trying to do here. It's like, what, like, just feel it, you know? Like, why is it that you immediately go there? Whereas when you're on the mountaintop, you're just there.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's funny. There's so much to unpack and like unpeel, I think.
That's so true. So I really feel that the kind of art that you are talking about is or can be a form of spiritual practice for the artist and for the receiver, isn't it?
For sure.
Right?
For sure. And like, I think, I mean, many artists will talk about that, right? And that that they had to do it, you know, that it's like this thing where if they're not creating, like everything suffers. You know, and I think in that sense, and it really is that testament to that idea that like our creativity is our life force, you know, and the more that we suppress our creativity, the more we're suppressing our life force. And ultimately it comes down to expression. Like they say that, you know, depression comes from suppression, right? And if we look at creativity in that same way, it's like, I do believe that we are all innately creative because we all have that life force within us. It's just that either we've forgotten how to connect to it or we've forgotten how to use it, you know. And I think artists in whatever form, whether it's trained or not trained or whatever it is, are able to connect to that and have that connection that everyone can have. It's just that artists are the ones who maybe professionally call themselves artists or, you know, things like that, take their art in a different form or a different level. That network or that connection perhaps has been more thoroughly nourished.
I wanted to pick a little bit on what you talked about earlier. When do you think we stopped being creative? Like, what actually happened that we are now, we as in a more general form, have stopped trusting this part of us, stopped connecting with this part of us?
I don't know. I mean, there's so much in that. We started The Artist's Way last night, and I was reading again the introduction to the book. And one of the things that she talks about is all of the things that we fear will happen if we become creative. And you're reading through this list and you're like, what, really? You know, like one of the common ones is I feel like I will be alone. I feel like I'll go crazy. I feel like I'll become unstable, or, you know, things like that. Like all of these like pretty existential core fears that somehow are tied to creativity. And I mean, one, I think that there has been so much of this narrative of like the destroyed artist. And I think that that has less to do with creativity than it does about the way in which arts and artists have or have not been supported, you know?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do think, like, if you think about creativity as life force, right, and aliveness, and we think about a society or societies where success comes from conforming. You know, success comes from like, how well can you fit into this box? But your vitality, your aliveness doesn't fit into a box, right? So there becomes a moment of choice, or many, many moments of choice, right? Where it's like, do I choose my aliveness and whatever form that could potentially take, or do I choose belonging? And that, like, it's so sad, I think, that somehow is put against each other.
Yeah.
There's this really beautiful book called Belonging by Tokopa Turner, where she talks about this process of, you know, being the creative outcast, the kind of dreamer, and then learning how to find that belonging within herself, and then ultimately in creative community and things like that. I think it comes down to a lot of fear of self, you know, and that fear of self comes from shame, you know, comes from all of these moments in life where authentic expression was not allowed for whatever reason. And then whatever meaning was then attributed to that not allowedness, you know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, it does.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the artist way. Let's talk about that a little bit more. It's a program that you're facilitating. Is it already fourth time? Yeah. What are the insights that you gained through running that program?
I mean, I think firstly, even just this idea of a recovery is really significant. This is like a 12-week program to recover your creativity, right? And I think that already sets like quite a tone versus things that are like, learn how to be creative, you know, because it really is coming from this angle of like, it's already there, you know, it's there, and how can we support each other to recover it? And yeah, having gone through it a number of times, I think every time I've gone through it, you know, different things stand out based off of, you know, where I'm at in my journey. But I think one of the things that has continued to stick with me a lot is this idea that support and nurturing can take you way farther than forcing, shaming, pushing. You know, in the Artist's Way, she talks a lot about the inner censor, and basically this part of us that is like not very kind, you know, is quite cruel. And I would say that a lot of people think that, or have experienced the inner censor as supportive, in the sense that it's like, get yourself out of bed, go do your morning pages, and like has that kind of like, you know, like your motivational whatever. But I have seen and I've experienced that like that kind of way of engaging with yourself isn't sustainable over time, right? That again comes back to that sense of like mind over body kind of thing. And, you know, Julia Cameron talks about how in your creativity, your inner artist is also your inner child, right? And, you know, we were talking earlier about like all these little moments, you know, so many of those moments happened when we were younger. So much of kind of unlocking and recovering comes from going back to that inner child and being like, hey, actually, it's okay now, right? And our inner children really don't like being yelled at. You know, like if your inner child is acting up or whatever, like they're gonna get even more intense if you start screaming at them. And like we are the same, you know. And so learning how to nurture and really soften, even when there's this structure that's asking a lot of you, asks a lot of discipline, a lot of commitment, there are a lot of doings. And like, how can you love yourself through them? How can you nurture yourself through them? How can you come towards every aspect to say, I'm doing this because I love you, you know, rather than because I want to shame you or I want you to be better, or I want you to, you know. And I feel like the artist way has had a lot to do with my also reframing of, yeah, my own myself, my work, how I show up, and giving a lot of permission to soften in that. Actually, can I read something?
Yes.
There's this one part that I was reading this morning, that I was like, every time I read it, I'm like, oh, yes. Where is it? Yeah. So she's talking about shadow artists, which are basically the people who, like, I would say art curators can be one, where they are the people who surround themselves with artists but don't practice art themselves. And she says, as a rule of thumb, shadow artists judge themselves harshly, beating themselves for years over the fact that they have not acted on their dreams. This cruelty only reinforces their status as shadow artists. Remember, it takes nurturing to make an artist. Shadow artists did not receive sufficient nurturing. They blame themselves for not acting fearlessly anyhow. And I feel like every time I read that, you know, I think about all the times of like, I've shamed myself for not being more courageous, or shamed myself for not doing the kind of, you know, the big creative act, right? But then when I kind of peel back and be like, well, it's because I didn't have this supportive, nurturing environment that lended itself towards that, you know, which more lended itself to fear, right? That makes a lot more sense, you know, and maybe I don't need to shame myself into my creativity, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though it sounds like a creative recovery journey, it's also a love recovery journey. I feel like creativity and love goes hand in hand. You have to really tap into that source of love unconditionally to then have the birth of creativity coming out and expressing the way that you want to express.
Yeah, totally. And like, I think creativity is, you know, ultimately it is a journey back to yourself, right? It is into your core. It is into like that sense of, yeah, like I like the word aliveness, right? That is like that wellspring within you that you can always return to. But that wellspring, yeah, it's sourced by love, you know? Yeah, and I think that that's super significant.
So you mentioned this creative power, this creative force, right? And we talked how it is, you know, innate. It's within us all. The question is whether we allow ourselves to tap into that. So how can we nurture that creative power?
I think that the pathway will be different for everyone in terms of the things that helps to support them. I mean, if you think about what makes you feel alive, what gives you joy, right? I think those are already things that are going to connect you into that sense of, a sense of you, at a deeper level, at that very kind of life-giving level. And I would say, for me personally, the two things are movement and looking, which is movement being like literally moving my body. I think something I always find really interesting is that I often see people who have a strong movement practice end up writing a lot. There's a tone, a quality to the writing that starts to emerge. And I think that that's from unlocking and freeing what's happening inside the body and then creating that channel, right? And kind of being able to access into, I don't know what the word is, but I want to say like higher wisdom through that.
Yeah.
And also sometimes it can be interesting because it almost feels like there's a certain poetry or a certain rhythm that can emerge through movement, which I find really interesting and really beautiful. And then the other thing I would say is, looking or like awareness and like paying attention, to life. Like even on the days where I just feel like awful, if I take myself out and I notice what's happening around me. Julia Cameron talks about how like art is the language of the sensuous, and it communicates through, sound, sight, touch. And so I think the more that you immerse yourself and attune to that way of being, the more that you start to connect into more of that creative perspective or frame of mind, and the more open you become to inspiration, I think. And like just like patterns, right? Patterns and colors and like the poetry that exists in life when you're really opening yourself to the beauty of it, right? Like if there's like something that probably inspires the most art, right? It's like love and beauty, and probably like deep pain, right? But these things
Which comes from a source of love and also beauty.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like it's things that move you.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, what I would say.
When you say movement, is it intuitive movement, free movement, or any movement?
I think it depends.
Okay.
I think it can be both, I think, again, I think intention is really important.
Yeah.
Like I personally, I don't know. I'd be curious to see like people who are like hardcore marathon runners, and who approach their running as like with that attitude. What movement, because I think the role of movement becomes different. Like, okay, this is going to sound super woo-woo. You don't have to include it in the thing, but I'm going to share it. So I've spent the last year living at McRitchie, like right next door. So I go like every day, twice a day, or I did. I really miss it. And I started to experience so there's like the part where you come into the car park, right? And like where the bathrooms and all that stuff is. And then you can either go right, which goes towards like the treetop walk, or you can go left, which goes towards like the golf course, right? My experience as a sensitive woo-woo person is when you go to the right side towards the treetops, there's such a different energy than on the other side. And my hypothesis basically is that on the right side is the running path And people, like, that's generally where people are doing their like morning runs, like groups of people doing their morning runs. And I think the trees can feel it. I can feel that they don't really care. Like, they're not giving love towards the trees. And there isn't a sense of attention being oriented outwards. And it just has a very different energy there. Whereas I find that on the other side, generally people are doing slow walks on the boardwalk, generally with families. It's a bit more accessible in that sense. And I find that there is a lightness there that almost feels like, the foliage, the trees, the whatever are being appreciated here. And like that people are slowing down and looking and moving a bit differently than perhaps they are on the other side. This is all my own hypothesis, okay? And my own observations. But I think, it's again like one of those things where, like, if you're feeling really down and stuck, right? And then you go for a run and it you connect into your life force energy again, and it creates that feeling of aliveness and like, amazing, great, like that has served the purpose that it needed to serve. Then I think there's movement, which is the intention is to, be a form of inquiry or a form of expression or a form of, orienting outwards, right? And I think they all can serve their purpose and have different purposes at different times. Yeah. So I wouldn't say any specific movement, but to move generally is going to do something.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it also kind of feels like art can be a way to take care of our well-being, to take care of ourselves.
Totally.
In a little bit different way than we are maybe used to. Can you share a little bit about that? What role does art play in our well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's, obviously there's many different forms of art. But I think when it comes to our well-being, it's about expression, and giving space for what's happening internally, or to have a space for what's happening internally, externally, and to give voice to our experiences. Like if we go back to this idea that, suppression is what often causes the most amount of kind of illnesses, right? Because it's suppressing that life force within your body, and your body can't, is always trying to come back into homeostasis, right? And so creating in whatever form, whether it's music, art, dance, painting, is a way of, again, creating movement, externalizing things that are happening inside. And like even I was saying, there's this, can I read another quote?
Of course.
That I remembered last night, which was that, darling, you feel heavy because you are too full of truth. Open your mouth more. Let the truth exist somewhere other than inside your body. And I feel like that's what art does. And like, I think it's, it has so many different purposes. Like, there's the art that comes for your own expression, right? And if you want to say like process-oriented art, where it really is about just like getting what's inside onto the page, like giving it color, giving it form, and then being able to relate to it in a different way through that, which already in itself is a lot, right? Or has such an impact. And then there is, the art that you're also receiving, right? And when you encounter art, how that forms or how that becomes a form of well-being as well. Like I'm reading this really amazing book. I read a lot, clearly. I'm reading this really amazing book that's called Your Brain on Art. And it's basically talking about like what's going on neurologically when you're looking at something, and like trying to track things like the experiences of awe and wonder and, why is it that when people encounter art, or when they can encounter art, that it can create these feelings inside, you know, and these feelings of expansion, warmth, connection, you know. And I think ultimately anything that helps create connection becomes a form of well-being. You know, this idea that, you know, it's not like when they talk about trauma, right? Like trauma isn't what happened to you. It's the absence of connection when you were experiencing it, you know. And I think connection of any form is that kind of healing balm to everything. And I think art has such an important role in creating connection, whether it's kind of connection within, connection without, and, you know, and connection between people, you know, to be able to relate to. Yeah. And it's like, I think, like, I've never considered myself, I think I was sharing with you before, like, I've never considered myself much of a, like, artist, you know, or like a painter, that kind of thing. But through a lot of my practices and through a lot of my, like, cultivating more of that connection inside, like, art has taken on so much stronger of a role, you know, because I feel like it's given me so much more voice, or like to give tangibility to so many experiences that I'm now aware of that I wasn't aware of before, you know, when I was more disconnected to my body, and helps to, allow for that to continue to move and continue to flow, you know, in ways that I think were a lot more challenging before. Anyway.
So right now, with your job or rather your role as art curator, as an embodiment facilitator, do you think it has brought you to a place where you are showing up and expressing art the way that you wish people would know more about, could experience in a form that creates the aliveness within, the creative force, the life force that you talk about? In this stage of your life, do you think you have reached that point?
I think I've held myself back a lot in terms of really pursuing on a bigger level these approaches towards art. I think for a while, especially like after traveling and then coming back into Singapore and feeling like a hippie in the city, you know, and having these thoughts and these approaches. Like, I think I remember then talking to a mentor of mine that had supported me so much, like in my, you know, becoming an art curator. And I was like saying, you know, I was just like, art is this form of healing, and we need to create spaces where people are able to engage with art in this kind of way. And she was like, why don't you go pursue art therapy? And I was like, no, like, yes, that of course has that same function, but that's not what I mean, you know? And I was like, why can't the museum also be a space of healing? You know, why can't it be more than just in a therapy room where art has this healing quality? And I think more and more, like, I'll openly admit, in the past few years, when I'm seeing, like, you know, National Museum has, or like National Gallery has a, you know, well-being program, and more of the museums have these like well-being programs, kind of like, there's that little part of me that's like, see, you know, like all those years ago. And I think that's on me, you know, I think that's on me to have not validated myself more in that, and had that willingness to potentially go to places that maybe are a bit more institutional and be like, actually there is so much room here for connection that's not being harnessed. And I still feel that way. I still feel like where I can kind of imagine and where I can see is like I would love to create more experiences with art on a bigger scale that have this kind of quality. And it's an interesting space because it does kind of intersect a lot of different places. And yeah, I think there's so much that is there. I mean, I have conversations with my the people who I used to work with in the museum, and they're like, well, like, so what do you actually mean? You know, and I still play around a lot with, you know, what is my role? Because I feel like on the art curator side, I want to like create all of these experiences and these stories through art. And then I also want to be there with people, you know, guiding them through, like facilitating their experience and cultivating that safe space where healing can happen with the art. Because I do think that right now, there's still a limit because of all of these different ideas of what these space, like how we are told to engage with these spaces, you know. And I love seeing exhibitions and art experiences which are really breaking those barriers down, you know, where people are like lying on the floor and engaging with something or taking off their shoes or, you know, and like engaging in that language of the art, which is the senses, you know. And I would like to see it more, and I would like to be a part of it more. So yeah, I definitely think I'm still moving from concept and small experiences to, yeah, really introducing it in a more, in a larger way. Yeah.
In a way, it's a breath of fresh air that everybody needed to feel.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I still have this dream of, like, I've named it so many different things at so many different times, but basically just like sacred experiences with art, you know, and where you can come in and you can, yeah, be with and exist in very like held, safe space, but where you can also, yeah, dance with the art and you can, you know, just have a bit more of this freer and, you know, like I've always felt that for me going into museums is a sacred experience, you know, like it helps me come into a way of being, you know, that I think other people experience when they go into different places of worship, you know, and yeah, I think having more of that sense of kind of reverence and holding and respect also, yeah, could be really, I don't know, I want to say nice, but just like really
normal,
supportive. Yeah.
It should be the norm.
Yeah.
We already tapped a little bit on the personal topic. I just wanted to dig a little bit deeper. How has been your creative recovery journey going personally?
Yeah, I would say I would say that I don't really feel so much of like a separation anymore. Like I don't feel the sense of like, oh, this is Julia being creative and this is Julia not being creative or something like that. Like I just feel like the way that I exist now is innately creative, you know, in the way that I just God, it sounds so cheesy, but like the way that I experience life, you know, and like the words that form when I look at something, or like the way I see things and the way I notice color and movement and texture and things like that. And I think then how that informs me kind of creatively is in writing, you know, is in painting, is in movement, you know, and I think these are things that are just a very normal part of my existence now. It's interesting to think about. I guess yeah, I don't know. I think it's more of like a creative life.
Yeah, creative living.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That resonates a lot, that we don't have to, create something or, perform something or showcase whatever we are doing, but it's actually about allowing ourselves to express whatever there is to be expressed and allowing these threads of creativity just to weave through our life, however it's going to be. And that could be through creative living. We don't have to become the best in, playing piano. You just can do it for the sake of living this creative life. And I feel that this is what it's all about, whether creating art or receiving art, and just doing it for the sake of it without expecting anything in return.
Totally. Like it's not product or outcome oriented.
Yeah.
That being said, it's like I feel like I've gone through this process where I needed to I never really cared about sharing what I did. I would say I don't even know if people know that I create or that I sing or that I all these different things, and it never really mattered to me. And now I would say that I'm experiencing more impetus to share, but again, not from like a product oriented kind of way or like, but more from a form of like sometimes I just start to experience things that feel like, beyond me in a way. And like times when I start to write and it takes on a certain tone, like that I was talking about, that feels like, okay, this isn't about me this time. And I'll share that, and I think ultimately, like there's, again, Julia Cameron says something where it's like, when you recognize that your creativity is a gift that's meant to be used, I think you start to also, it's like you go through these processes where it's like, okay, I'm recovering this for myself. I need to have this very personal, intimate relationship with something. And then, and then you kind of start to wonder what it's like, beyond just your own relationship with that creation. What happens when it then meets someone else, and then takes on a life of its own. And then, that sense of like, what is mine and what isn't. And if creativity is something that is available to all of us and there is this creative flow, I don't know, it takes on a whole other level. And I do think that some things are meant to be shared. Yeah.
On the note of sharing, do you have a poem that you wanted to share with us?
I do. So this is a poem that I return to all the time. I think especially when you're talking about things like, and about creativity and often about like perfectionism, and that sense of aliveness and the mess that is life. This always kind of gives me a little bit of that permission slip for being. So it's a poem called Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, The world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things.
That's beautiful.
Mm.
We are slowly arriving to the end. I wanted to ask you, what advice do you have for those who are looking to infuse a little bit more creativity into their everyday lives, to foster this deeper connection with themselves?
I would say to get out, even if it's like, a small walk for like 5 or 10 minutes, or just going to the food court you don't normally go to. I think exposing ourselves to different ways of being, to noticing, is already, a moment that's taking you. Sometimes I think you have to take yourself out of yourself to find yourself again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the case often with creativity. It's like you don't just kind of close your eyes and look within and be like, where is that creative force? Like, where can I find it? I think sometimes when we attune out and we notice, we allow for what's within to kind of arise. Yeah.
And then one question that we ask every guest: what is heart-centered living for you? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I think for me, like, I think I was talking a little bit about, or like I talk a lot about intention. And I think so much about like how everything that we do can take on a different tone, depending on the intention. And I think that's the same with kind of like heart space living. I think it's a way of kind of coming towards life from a space of loving awareness, and just being able to kind of hold things in a more gentle, soft way. And I think that's what it means to kind of move through life from that kind of space.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, for agreeing to meet with us. It was beautiful, beautiful conversation, and we deeply enjoyed it.
Yes, we do. Where can people find you, or anything you'd like to share?
They can follow me on Instagram. It's a private account though.
Yeah.
Which is just jvasko25 that's my profile name.
Okay. And that's where you will announce anything new that you're planning for. Amazing.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia.